What is the one thing that brings you absolute joy? 4 years ago, he shattered my reality in a sterile estate lawyer's office in downtown Chicago. We had been married for 19 years and were supposed to be finalizing our family trust. Instead, right as the attorney handed him a titanium pen, my husband pushed the heavy parchment away. He turned to me, completely dead-eyed, and announced he wanted a divorce. He was leaving me for his 24-year-old spin class instructor. He was 46. I sat there frozen in my sensible wool coat while he clinically explained that I had become too domestic and predictable. He claimed he needed a partner who matched his entrepreneurial velocity. I had raised his twin boys, managed our household through his 3 failed business launches, and nursed him through a severe spinal surgery. Apparently that made me too domestic. Pierce, the estate attorney, didn't say a word. He just slowly pulled the unclicked pen back across the massive mahogany desk and stared at his legal pad. Conrad didn't wait for a response from either of us. He stood up, adjusted the cuffs of his custom-tailored shirt, and walked out of the glass-walled conference room. I listened to his leather shoes click all the way down the hallway. I took the L train home that afternoon because he had taken the car. I sat staring at the dirty floor of the train car, still wearing that wool coat, feeling the cold seep into my bones. Within 2 months, the divorce was moving through the courts with brutal efficiency, and Conrad was fully funding his midlife crisis. He purchased a $1.2 million industrial loft in the West Loop, exposed brick, floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of place that echoed when you walked. He leased a matte black Porsche 911. His social media, which used to just be occasional photos of our backyard grill, turned into a non-stop highlight reel of a man desperately clinging to youth. VIP bottle service in Miami, courtside basketball tickets, photos of her, Britt, the spin instructor, in designer swimwear, holding oversized champagne sparklers, while he grinned at the camera with unnervingly white veneers he'd just bought. His bio was actually updated to building empires and chasing sunsets. Our twin boys, Noah and Silas, were 14 at the time. Conrad dropped them completely. It wasn't a sudden severing, but a slow, agonizing fade that hurt them far more. He missed their state hockey championship because he had a networking event in Vegas. He missed Noah's terrifying ER visit for a shattered collarbone. I had been sitting in the freezing triage waiting room at 11 to Lalo p.m., the smell of antiseptic burning my nose, listening to my son groan in pain while I repeatedly called his father. It went straight to voicemail. Conrad was off the grid at an exclusive mindfulness retreat in Tulum with Britt. He was entirely consumed by his shiny new existence. I spent the next year operating like a ghost in my own home. I survived on black coffee, lost 20 pounds from sheer stress, and stared at the bedroom ceiling until 4 a.m. most nights. The house was too quiet without his chaos, and yet I felt like I couldn't breathe in it. My best friend Sarah practically had to force feed me dinner. She would show up on my porch at 7 o'clock with aluminum trays of baked ziti and sit at the island, watching me chew until I finished at least half a portion. But eventually, the devastating fog began to lift. It didn't happen overnight, but one morning I woke up and the crushing weight on my chest felt manageable. The sadness crystallized into a cold, hard ambition. I realized I was 45 years old and I had spent 2 decades folding myself into smaller and smaller shapes to make room for Conrad's ego. I took the $15,000 we had sitting in a joint savings account meant for a kitchen remodel, my half of the only liquid cash that wasn't tied up in the settlement, and I signed a commercial lease on a dilapidated storefront 2 miles from my house. I finally opened the artisanal bakery I had been quietly dreaming about since my 20s. I poured all my betrayal into kneading dough before dawn. My hands were constantly covered in flour, my knuckles cracked from the dry winter air and the constant hand washing. I also started weightlifting, going to a grim, no-frills gym at 8 at Douglas p.m. After closing the shop, I used the heavy iron to physically exhaust myself so I could finally sleep. I built physical and mental armor. I didn't do it to show him what he lost. I did it to remember who I was before he drained me. Then, 14 months ago, the universe intervened. I was at a massive restaurant supply warehouse on a Tuesday afternoon, exhausted, struggling to lift a 50-pound sack of rye flour into the back of my Subaru. The suspension groaned, and I was losing my grip on the thick paper siding when a man stepped up and offered his help. His name was Marcus. He owned a small batch coffee roastery 2 towns over. He had warm, tired eyes, calloused hands, and a gentle demeanor. We stood in the asphalt parking lot, leaning against the bumpers of our cars, talking about wholesale profit margins and temperamental commercial ovens for an hour. We've been inseparable ever since. Marcus is steady. He doesn't need to perform for an audience. There is no social media reel. There are no champagne sparklers. He spent an entire Saturday in my driveway teaching Noah and Silas how to change the brake pads on my Subaru. I watched from the kitchen window as the 3 of them laughed, covered in black grease, completely content. It was the first time in years I saw my boys look at an older man with actual respect. But the absolute best part of this story happened last Tuesday at 6:15 a.m. I was in the bakery kitchen, pulling the first batch of sourdough from the deck oven. My phone buzzed on the stainless steel prep table. It was an unknown number. I wiped my hands on my apron and answered it. It was Conrad, hyperventilating. It was the first time I had heard his actual voice in nearly 4 years. His flashy tech logistics startup had just been raided by the ears. His investors had completely pulled out when the discrepancies surfaced, and he was hit with a crippling $350,000 tax lien. The absolute second his bank accounts were frozen by the federal government, the spin instructor vanished. She literally packed her bags while he was sitting in a brutal legal deposition with federal auditors. She took the purebred French bulldog and the Cartier watch he had bought her for Christmas. She left the loft keys on the kitchen island. He called me from a prepaid burner phone because his primary Verizon service had been disconnected. The line crackled with cheap static. He was sobbing, actual, wet sobs echoing over the connection. He was begging me to help him cover a lawyer's retainer. He told me he had no one else. He actually had the audacity to ask if he could sleep on my basement couch because he was facing formal eviction from the West Loop loft by Friday afternoon. I stood there in the warm, yeast-scented air of my bakery. I didn't yell. I didn't hurl insults. I didn't remind him of the ER visit or the state championship. I just took a deep breath, told him he needed to tap into that entrepreneurial velocity to solve his own problems, and quietly hung up the phone. I blocked the burner number immediately, put the phone back in my pocket, and went back to slicing lemons for the morning pastries. I thought that was the end of it. I thought the universe had delivered a perfectly wrapped package of cosmic justice, and I could finally close the book on Conrad Voss. I was wrong. A desperate man doesn't just evaporate because you hang up on him. Thursday afternoon, I was at the bakery going over the weekly payroll when the bell above the front door chimed. I looked up expecting the afternoon coffee rush. Instead, Noah walked in. He's 18 now, a senior in high school, tall and broad-shouldered from hockey. But right then, he looked small. He was pale, his jaw tight, his backpack slung loosely over one shoulder. "Mom," he said, his voice dropping an octave the way it does when he's trying to control his temper. "We need to talk." I wiped down the counter and led him to the small table by the window. "What's wrong? Where's your brother?" "Silas is in the car," Noah said, staring at the scarred wood of the table. "He wouldn't come in. He's pissed at me. But you need to know." My stomach tightened. "Know what? Dad was waiting at the school parking lot today," Noah said. "He didn't have the Porsche. He was in this beat-up Hyundai. He looked like garbage, Mom. He cornered us by Silas's truck." The blood rushed out of my face. "Did he touch you? Did he hurt you?" "No," Noah scoffed, shaking his head bitterly. "He just cried, right there in front of the field house. He told us he made a mistake. He told us his business partners framed him, that the government froze everything he owns, and that he's going to be sleeping in his car tonight." Noah looked up at me, his eyes practically vibrating with anger. "He asked us for money, Mom. He asked if we could access the college savings accounts you set up for us. He told Silas it was a temporary loan. He said if we didn't help him, he was going to jail." I felt physically sick. The audacity of it. The sheer, venomous selfishness. To bypass me and put that kind of psychological weight on his teenage sons. The college accounts were in a trust that I managed, locked down specifically to prevent Conrad from ever touching them. But the boys knew the balances. They knew the money was there. "What did you say to him?" I asked, keeping my voice as level as possible. "I told him to go to hell," Noah snapped. "I told him he hadn't spoken to me in 3 years, and he wasn't getting a dime." I exhaled slowly, reaching out to squeeze his arm. "Good, you did the right thing, Noah. He's lying to you. He's not going to jail. He's just broke, and it's his own fault." Noah didn't look relieved. He pulled his arm back slightly. "I know that, but Silas doesn't." I froze. "What do you mean?" "Silas felt bad for him. You know how he is. He hates seeing people cry," Noah said, his voice tight with frustration. "Silas told Dad he had a few thousand saved up from his summer landscaping job. Dad told him not to tell you. They exchanged numbers. Dad gave him some temporary cell number." I pushed my chair back so fast it scraped loudly against the concrete floor. "Where is Silas now?" "I told you. He's in the truck. But he's talking about giving Dad the money. He thinks we're abandoning him. He thinks we're being cruel." I marched out from behind the counter, threw my apron onto a stool, and walked out the front door of the bakery. The afternoon air was brisk, biting at my face. Silas's battered Ford pickup was parked at the curb. I could see him sitting in the driver's seat, staring down at his phone. I opened the passenger door and slid in. The cab smelled like old pine air freshener and baseball leather. Silas jumped, quickly turning his phone screen face down against his thigh. He wouldn't look at me. "Silas," I said gently. "I don't want to hear it," he muttered, staring out the windshield at the passing traffic. "He's using you," I said, ignoring his deflection. "He has no right to put this on you. His financial problems are his own. He's our dad." Silas snapped, finally turning to me. His eyes were red-rimmed. "He's literally going to be sleeping on the street, Mom. You hung up on him. Noah told him to drop dead. I can't just let him freeze. It's my money. I earned it. And you need it for your first year of tuition," I countered, keeping my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "Silas, listen to me. This man abandoned us. He didn't call you on your birthday. He didn't care about us until he ran out of options. If you give him that money, you will never see it again, and it won't fix his life. You don't know that," Silas yelled, hitting the steering wheel with the heel of his hand. "You just hate him. You want him to suffer." The accusation stung, sharp and deep. I sat there in the heavy silence of the truck cab, looking at my son. He looked so much like his father right then. The same slope of the jaw, the same stubborn set to his mouth. But where Conrad was hollow, Silas was just hurting. He was an 18-year-old boy desperately wanting to believe that his father's sudden reappearance was about him, not his bank account. "I don't want him to suffer," I said quietly, "but I won't let him drag you down with him." Silas picked up his phone. "I'm going to meet him at the diner on 4th Street, he said, his voice trembling but defiant. "I'm just going to buy him dinner. That's it, just dinner." "Silas, don't do this." He reached for the ignition. "Get out of the truck, Mom." I opened the heavy metal door and stepped out onto the curb. The afternoon wind whipped my hair across my face, stinging my cheeks. I slammed the door shut. Silas didn't hesitate. He pulled out into the 4-lane traffic, the truck's old engine whining, and didn't look in the rearview mirror once. I watched his brake lights flare at the intersection before he turned right and disappeared. I walked back into the bakery. Noah was aggressively wiping down the glass pastry case with a damp rag, pressing hard enough to make the glass flex. He looked up as the door chimed. "He left," I said, my voice flatter than I felt. Noah threw the rag into the utility sink. "Unbelievable. He's such an idiot." "He's not an idiot. He's just 18, I said. I walked behind the counter, untied my apron, and draped it over the espresso machine. I grabbed my car keys from the register drawer. "Lock up at 5. If I'm not back, take an Uber home. I'll pay you back from petty cash." "Where are you going?" "To the diner." The drive to 4th Street took exactly 9 minutes. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel the entire time. When I pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of the diner, I saw Silas's truck parked crookedly near the dumpsters. I parked 3 spots away, turned off the engine, and forced myself to take one deep, measured breath. I was not going to scream. I was not going to make a scene. I was just going to protect my son. I walked inside. The diner smelled like stale bleach and burnt hash browns. Faye, the shift manager who usually came into my bakery on Sunday mornings, was behind the register. She gave me a polite, exhausted nod. I didn't stop to chat. I scanned the red vinyl booths along the back wall. They were in the very last one. Conrad sat with his back to the kitchen, swinging doors. Seeing him in person for the first time in 4 years felt like looking at a stranger wearing my ex-husband's skin. The forced, expensive youthfulness was entirely gone. His skin was gray, he was unshaven, and his shoulders slumped under a wrinkled navy quarter zip sweater. But he was leaning across the Formica table, talking fast, his hands moving emphatically. Silas sat opposite him, looking small and intensely uncomfortable. His wallet was sitting on the table next to a half-empty glass of water. But it wasn't the wallet that made my stomach drop. It was the paperwork. Conrad had a printed document spread out between the ketchup bottle and the napkin dispenser, and he was tapping a blue ballpoint pen against the signature line. I walked right up to the edge of the booth. "Hello, Conrad," he flinched. It was a full body flinch, like I had physically struck him. His head snapped up, and for a split second, the salesman charm completely dissolved into cornered panic. Then, the mask slid back into place, though it didn't quite fit anymore. "I'm just having lunch with my son," Conrad said, his voice dripping with forced calm. "Is that a crime now? Does my parole officer need to be notified?" I ignored him and looked down at the table. I reached over and spun the document around so I could read the header. It was a residential lease guarantor application for a luxury high-rise apartment complex downtown. Not a cheap studio, a luxury high-rise. The blood roared in my ears. I looked at Silas. "Do you know what this is?" "He just needs a co-signer, Mom," Silas said defensively, staring at his lap. "Because of the Ayers thing, his credit is frozen. It's just a formality so he doesn't have to sleep in his car. He's going to pay the rent." "A formality," I repeated. I looked back at Conrad, the sheer, unadulterated gall of the man. "You want an 18-year-old kid who works landscaping for $15 an hour to legally guarantee a lease on a luxury apartment? I have a consulting deal closing next week," Conrad hissed, leaning forward. His eyes were darting nervously around the diner. "The capital is secured. I just need a bridge until the government clears my primary accounts. It's a signature. It costs him nothing. If you default, which you will, because you have no money and you're under federal investigation, they come after him," I said, keeping my voice low and lethal. I looked at Silas, making sure he was listening. "They will drain your bank account. They will destroy your credit score before you even step foot on a college campus. You won't be able to get a student loan. You won't be able to rent your own apartment. He is asking you to set yourself on fire so he can stay warm. Stop poisoning him against me." Conrad snapped, his voice cracking. Several heads turned in the nearby booths. He lowered his voice, gripping the edge of the table. "I am his father. I provided for you both for 20 years. I gave you that house. I built the life you're living. You left us for a 24-year-old who stole your dog and ran," I said simply. "You built nothing. You just extracted." Silas looked back and forth between us. He was pale. He looked at the guarantor application, then at the pen in his father's hand. He saw the tremble in Conrad's fingers. He saw the desperate, hollow look in his eyes. Slowly, Silas reached across the table and slid the paperwork out of Conrad's reach. Conrad's face fell. "Silas, please, buddy, I'm begging you." Silas reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a thick white envelope, and dropped it onto the table. "There's $2,000 in there. It's everything I made this summer. Take it. Sleep in a motel. Buy food. But I'm not signing that paper." I held my breath. I wanted to snatch the envelope off the table to protect Silas's hard-earned money, but I knew I couldn't. Silas had to make this choice. He was buying a $2,000 lesson in who his father really was. Conrad didn't thank him. He didn't cry tears of gratitude. He didn't tell Silas he loved him. Instead, Conrad snatched the envelope off the table, cracked the seal, and quickly thumbed through the 20s and 50s inside. His jaw tight, he looked up at his son, his expression twisting into something ugly and resentful. $2,000. Conrad scoffed bitterly. "This won't even cover the deposit on a short-term rental. What the hell am I supposed to do with this?" Silas shattered. You could practically see it happen in his eyes. The hopeful, desperate boy looking for his dad vanished, replaced by a terrible, cold clarity. Silas didn't say a word. He stood up, bumped his thigh hard against the edge of the table, and walked right past me. He pushed through the glass doors of the diner and headed straight for his truck. I looked at Conrad. He was already shoving the envelope into his coat pocket. "Don't ever contact my boys again," I said. I turned and walked out. I didn't follow Silas to his truck. I got into my Subaru and drove back to the bakery in total silence. When I got home that night, Silas's bedroom door was shut. I didn't knock. I knew he needed to grieve the father he thought he could save. I thought the worst was over. I thought the $2,000 was the final toll I would have to pay to get Conrad Voss out of our lives for good. The next morning, at 8:30 a.m., I was in the bakery kitchen trying to focus on inventory. Marcus was coming over later to help me fix a leaking espresso gasket, and I was looking forward to the quiet normalcy of his company. My cell phone rang. The caller ID flashed a name I hadn't seen in 3 years. Ingrid Voss, my ex-mother-in-law. When Conrad and I split, Ingrid had cut me off completely. She took her son's side without hesitation, telling me over the phone that I had always been too rigid and that I should have been more supportive of Conrad's ambitions. She didn't send the boys birthday cards. She didn't call on holidays. She completely erased us from her life to maintain her perfect relationship with her golden child. I stared at the screen, a sick feeling settling in my stomach. I wiped flour off my hands and answered it. "Hello, Ingrid? Nora?" Her voice was thin, fragile, and trembling violently. It didn't sound like the proud, imposing woman who used to critique my Thanksgiving turkey. She sounded terrified. "Yes, it's me. I didn't know who else to call," she sobbed. The sound of her weeping was so raw it made me grip the edge of the stainless steel prep table. He wouldn't pick up. His phone is disconnected. "Nora, I don't know what to do." "What happened, Ingrid?" I asked, a cold dread creeping up my neck. "The bank," she choked out. "The men from from the bank are here. They brought papers. Papers for what? Foreclosure, she whispered, her voice breaking completely. Conrad, he had me co-sign a commercial loan for his logistics company 2 years ago. He told me it was just a technicality. He put up my house as collateral. He swore to me the business was booming. Nora, they're taking my house. I closed my eyes. The rhythmic, mechanical hum of the bakery's dough mixer suddenly felt entirely detached from the reality of what I was hearing. I pressed my flour-dusted fingertips against my forehead, taking a long, slow breath. Ingrid, listen to me, I said, my voice stripping away any trace of the resentment I had harbored for the last 4 years. Are those men still at your house? No, she wheezed. I could hear the frail, wet sound of her breathing. They handed me a thick manila envelope and left. They told me the property is scheduled for a sheriff's auction in 45 days. Nora, I've lived here since 1982. Conrad took his first steps in the living room. I don't understand. I don't understand how this is happening. I'm coming over, I said. Lock the door. Make yourself a cup of tea and sit at the kitchen table. Do not call Conrad. Do you hear me? Do not try to call him. Okay, she whispered, sounding like a frightened child. I hung up and immediately called Marcus. He answered on the second ring. I gave him a rapid-fire, 30-second explanation of the situation. He didn't ask clarifying questions. He didn't offer empty platitudes. I'm leaving the roastery now, Marcus said smoothly. I'll be at the bakery in 12 minutes. Leave the keys in the register. I'll manage the front, run the afternoon bake, and lock up. Go deal with her. Take all the time you need. I untied my apron, grabbed my coat, and walked out the back door. Ingrid lived in Evanston, in a pristine, tree-lined neighborhood composed of historic Tudor homes. It was the house Conrad had grown up in, the house his late father had worked 30 years at a manufacturing plant to pay off. When I pulled into the wide paver-stone driveway, the immaculate landscaping felt like a sick joke. The hydrangeas were perfectly pruned. The brass house numbers gleamed. Nothing on the outside indicated that the life inside had completely collapsed. I used the spare key hidden under the heavy cast iron planter, a habit Ingrid had maintained for decades, and let myself in. The house smelled exactly as it always had, expensive lemon polish and dried lavender. I found her sitting at the massive mahogany dining table. She looked 20 years older than the last time I had seen her. She was wearing a silk robe over her clothes, her hair unstyled and flat against her scalp. She was staring blankly at a stack of legal documents spread across the polished wood. When she saw me, her chin trembled. She didn't say a word, just pushed the papers toward my side of the table. I pulled out a heavy chair and sat down. I picked up the documents. It was a notice of default and intent to foreclose from a commercial lending group in Delaware. I scanned the dense, bureaucratic paragraphs, my eyes searching for the numbers. When I found them, I felt a physical wave of nausea wash over me. The principal balance was $850,000. Conrad hadn't just used his mother's house to secure a small bridge loan. He had leveraged the entire appraised value of the property to inject capital into his failing logistics company. He had drained every single drop of equity his parents had spent a lifetime building. I flipped to the second page, looking at the signatures. There was Ingrid's frail, looping cursive, dated 22 months ago. Below it was Conrad's sharp, aggressive scrawl. Ingrid, I said softly, setting the paper down. Did you read this when you signed it? Did you know how much money he was taking out? She shook her head, tears spilling over her wrinkled cheeks, spotting the silk collar of her robe. He came to me. He brought a notary with him, a young man in a suit. Conrad told me the business was expanding so fast he needed liquidity to buy a fleet of trucks. He said traditional banks moved too slow. He promised me, he swore on his father's grave, Nora, that the loan would be retired in 6 months. He said my name would be off the deed by Christmas of that year. And you never checked? I asked, trying to keep the judgment out of my voice. You never received statements in the mail? Conrad had all the correspondence routed to his corporate office. She choked out. He told me he didn't want to burden me with the paperwork. He brought me flowers. He took me to dinner at the club. He looked so successful. Why would I doubt him? He's my son. I stared at the paperwork. The sheer, calculated sociopathy of it was staggering. He had bet his mother's shelter, her security, her entire legacy on a business he had to know was hemorrhaging money. And when the ears finally kicked the doors in and froze his assets, he knew this default was coming. He knew the bank would seize the Evanston house. He knew all of this yesterday, when he sat in that dirty diner, crying crocodile tears, and took $2,000 from his 18-year-old son. I have nothing else, Ingrid whispered, her voice cracking the silence. My pension goes entirely to property taxes and utilities. If they take the house, Nora, I have nowhere to go. I don't have savings. I gave him my savings, too. I snapped my head up. What? When? Ingrid shrank back slightly, looking deeply ashamed. She wrapped her arms around her thin torso. 3 weeks ago. Before the news broke about the government raid. He came over late at night. He said there was a temporary cash flow issue with payroll. He was so stressed, Nora, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He asked if I could wire him $50,000 from my retirement account, just for a week, just to make payroll. My blood ran cold. 3 weeks ago. Conrad didn't take that money for payroll. If the ears was already circling, the accounts were likely already under surveillance or freezing. He knew the ship was sinking. He took his mother's last $50,000 to create a golden parachute for himself. It was cash. Untraceable, liquid cash. Did you wire it? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She nodded, staring at her hands. It was the last of the mutual funds Arthur left me. The account is empty. He wasn't broke. The narrative he spun for Noah and Silas, the beat-up Hyundai, the threat of sleeping in his car, the desperate need for a cosigner, it was all a manufactured performance. He was hiding the $50,000. He was playing the victim to extract whatever remaining cash he could from his children before he vanished completely. I felt a sudden, terrifying spike of adrenaline. Silas, Conrad had spent an hour alone with Silas at the diner. He had taken the $2,000. But what else had he said? If Conrad was actively hiding assets from the federal government, he wouldn't keep the money in an account with his name on it. He wouldn't wouldn't keep it in his pockets. I stood up so fast my chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. Ingrid flinched. Nora, what is it? Pack a bag, I commanded, pulling my phone out of my pocket. Pack enough clothes for a week. Get your medications. Bring your passport, your driver's license, and every single financial document you have in this house. Put them in a box. Where am I going? She asked, her voice trembling with panic. You're coming to my house, I said, dialing Silas's number. You can't stay here right now. Pack the bag, Ingrid, now. She didn't argue. The imposing, critical woman who used to tell me my homemade cranberry sauce was too tart stood up obediently and shuffled toward the stairs like a ghost. I put the phone to my ear. It rang 3 times. 4, 5. Hey, you've reached Silas. Leave a message. I hung up and dialed Noah. He picked up immediately. Hey, Mom. Things are fine here at the house, Noah said, his voice relaxed. I could hear the television playing in the background. I did my homework. Is Silas there? I asked, walking briskly toward the front door. No, I thought he was still at the bakery with you. His truck isn't in the driveway. I stopped with my hand on the brass doorknob. Noah, think carefully. When Silas came home from the diner yesterday, did he say anything else about his conversation with Dad? Did Dad ask him to do anything besides sign that lease? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The casualness completely drained from Noah's voice. He didn't talk to me much. He was mostly just pissed about the $2,000, but he was looking for something in his room last night, tearing his closet apart. Looking for what? His birth certificate, Noah said slowly, and his social security card. I asked him why he needed them. He said his landscaping boss needed them for tax forms, but that didn't make sense because he's been working there since May. My stomach plummeted. I felt lightheaded. A co-signer application for an apartment wasn't the only thing Conrad had brought to the diner. Noah, I said, my voice tight. Call Silas. Call his friends. Call his girlfriend. Track his location on your phone if he still shares it with you. Find out exactly where he is right now. Mom, what's going on? Just do it, I said, and ended the call. I turned back to the empty, quiet foyer of Ingrid's house. The gravity of the situation pressed down on my chest like a physical weight. Conrad wasn't just trying to survive a financial collapse. He was actively committing federal fraud, and he was using his 18-year-old son as the mule to hide the stolen money. If Silas opened a bank account or a safety deposit box with his clean social security number, and Conrad deposited that $50,000, Silas wouldn't just lose his money. He would be legally implicated in a federal tax evasion investigation. He could go to prison. I heard Ingrid dragging a small leather suitcase down the hardwood stairs. It bumped heavily against each step. I walked over, took the suitcase from her trembling hands, and led my ex-husband's mother out of the house her son had destroyed. The drive back to my house took 40 minutes due to rush hour traffic. Ingrid sat in the passenger seat, completely silent, staring out the window at the gray Chicago sky. I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios. When I pulled into my driveway, Silas's old Ford pickup was still missing. I helped Ingrid inside, settled her on the living room sofa, and brought her a glass of water. She looked around my modest, comfortable living room, the space I had bought and furnished entirely on my own after the divorce, with a look of profound defeat. Noah came down the stairs, his phone in his hand. He looked at Ingrid, then at me, his eyes wide with confusion. I'll explain later, I told Noah quietly, intercepting him in the hallway. Did you reach your brother? Noah shook his head, straight to voicemail. I checked his location sharing. He turned it off, Mom. He's never turned it off before. I leaned against the hallway wall, closing my eyes. I needed to think. I needed to act like an adult, not a panicked mother. Where would Conrad take him? To a bank? To a private vault facility? My phone buzzed in my hand. It was a text message from a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local. Mom, don't be mad. I'm helping him fix this. I'll be home for dinner. I stared at the screen. The text was followed by a dropped pin for a location. I tapped the map. It loaded, zooming in on a commercial address in the South Loop. It wasn't a bank. It wasn't an apartment building. It was a self-storage facility. Stay here, I told Noah, grabbing my keys off the console table. Watch your grandmother. Order a pizza. Do not leave this house. Mom, I'm coming with you, Noah insisted, stepping in front of me. If Dad is pulling some sketchy, no, I said, my voice leaving absolutely no room for debate. You stay here. If I'm not back in 2 hours, I will call you. I drove toward the city, the afternoon light fading into a dull, bruised dusk. The self-storage facility was located under the shadow of the interstate overpass, a massive, windowless concrete block surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. It was exactly the kind of place you rented if you wanted to bury a problem where no one asked questions. I pulled through the open automatic gate and parked near the main office. There were hundreds of identical orange metal doors stretching down long, poorly lit corridors. I saw Silas's truck parked halfway down row G. I parked my Subaru blocking the exit lane of the row, got out, and walked toward the truck. The driver's side door was unlocked. The keys were gone. I walked slowly down the corridor of units. The concrete floor echoed with my footsteps. It smelled like dust, old cardboard, and gasoline. About 30 yards down, Unit G114 was rolled open halfway. The harsh fluorescent light from inside spilled out onto the pavement. I stepped up to the edge of the unit. Conrad was inside. He was standing with his back to me, wearing the same wrinkled navy sweater. He was violently throwing heavy cardboard boxes out of the way, tearing through a stack of plastic storage bins with a frantic, desperate energy. The floor was littered with debris, old files, a broken lamp, a deflated basketball. Silas stood near the entrance, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He looked terrified. I don't understand, Silas was saying, his voice shaking. You said the paperwork was in here. You said we just needed to get the deed to the boat so we could sell it. Why are we tearing everything apart? Conrad didn't stop digging. It's here. She had to have put it here. Britt packed the office before she left. She must have put the hard drive in one of these boxes. Dad, stop, Silas pleaded. You're scaring me. What hard drive? The crypto ledger. Conrad screamed, spinning around. His face was red, his eyes manic and bloodshot. screenshot. He looked completely unhinged. The wallets. It's the only money the feds don't know about. She took the dog, she took the watch, but she wouldn't have known what the drive looked like. She just threw everything in boxes. He turned back and kicked a plastic bin so hard it shattered, sending a cascade of old tax documents spilling across the concrete floor. I stepped into the light of the unit. She didn't pack it, Conrad, I said. Both of them jumped. Silas looked at me, a wave of immense relief washing over his pale face. Conrad stared at me, his chest heaving, his hands covered in dust. What are you doing here? You followed him? I didn't have to. He sent me his location, I said, keeping my voice dead level. I stepped between him and my son. Tell him, Conrad. Tell your 18-year-old son why you really need his social security number. Tell him about the $50,000 you stole from your mother's retirement account 3 weeks ago. Conrad froze. The manic energy drained out of him, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. Silas looked at his father, his eyes widening. What is she talking about? Grandma's retirement? She's lying, Conrad said instinctively, but his voice lacked conviction. He looked at the floor, refusing to meet Silas's eyes. She's sitting on my sofa right now, Conrad, I said. She came to me crying because the bank served her with foreclosure papers this afternoon. You let them take the house. You drained her last mutual fund, and now you dragged our son down to a storage locker to help you launder hidden cryptocurrency. It's not laundering, Conrad snapped, stepping forward. It's my money. I earned it. The government has no right to freeze my life. You didn't earn anything, I said, stepping closer to him, forcing him to back up. You stole from investors, you stole from your mother, and now you're trying to use Silas as a human shield so you don't rot in federal prison. I grabbed Silas's arm. It was rigid. Give me your birth certificate, I told him, and your social security card. Right now. Silas didn't hesitate. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out the folded documents, and handed them to me. His hands were shaking violently. Conrad watched the exchange. His jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. He looked pathetic. A middle-aged man standing in the ruins of his own arrogance, surrounded by broken plastic bins in a cheap storage unit. You're making a mistake, Nora, Conrad said, his voice dropping to a low, venomous register. If I go down, there's a blast radius. You think you're safe in your little bakery? You think the forensic accountants won't look at our divorce settlement? They're going to tear your life apart trying to find my assets. Let them look, I said. I took a broken heart and $15,000. Everything I built with my own hands. I have nothing to hide. I turned to Silas. Go get in your truck. Drive home. Don't break the speed limit. I am right behind you. Silas didn't say a word to his father. He turned and walked out of the unit, his boots echoing sharply on the concrete. I looked at Conrad one last time. Don't ever contact my children again. If I see your car in my town, if I hear your voice on the phone, I won't just block your number. I will call the federal prosecutor handling your case, and I will give them the exact location of this storage unit. I didn't wait for a response. I walked out, pulled the corrugated metal door down with a deafening crash, and left him in the dark. The drive back to the suburbs was agonizingly slow. I kept my headlights fixed on the battered tailgate of Silas's Ford the entire way. He drove exactly the speed limit, taking the turns with a stiff, robotic precision. The adrenaline that had propelled me through the storage facility was evaporating, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. My hands ached from gripping the steering wheel. We pulled into our driveway side by side. The porch light was on, casting a warm yellow glow against the brick facade. Marcus's truck was parked on the street. He had closed the bakery. Silas turned off his engine but didn't get out. I walked over and opened his door. He was staring straight ahead at the garage door. Come inside, I said gently. He didn't move for a long time. Then, he unbuckled his seatbelt, grabbed his backpack, and stepped out. He looked at me, his eyes glassy and vacant in the dim light. He didn't even care about the money I gave him. Silas whispered, his voice cracking. It wasn't enough for him. Nothing is ever enough for him. I know, sweetheart, I said, putting my arm around his stiff shoulders. I know. We walked through the front door. The house smelled intensely of baked mozzarella and garlic. Noah had ordered the pizza. Marcus was standing in the kitchen, wiping down the counters. When he saw us, he stopped, threw the towel over his shoulder, and walked straight over. He didn't ask what happened. He just looked at my face, then at Silas's pale, defeated expression, and nodded. There's a plate in the microwave for you, Silas, Marcus said softly. Noah's in the basement playing video games. He wanted to give you space. Silas gave a tight, almost imperceptible nod and walked past us, heading straight for the basement stairs. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him, and the house fell quiet. I walked into the living room. Ingrid was exactly where I had left her, sitting rigidly on the edge of the sofa, a cold cup of tea on the coaster in front of her. The leather suitcase sat by the front door like an anchor. Did you find him? She asked, her voice trembling. I sat down in the armchair across from her. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and rubbed my face. I found him. He's fine. Physically, he's fine. The money, she choked out, pressing her manicured hands to her mouth. The $50,000. He still has it, I told her, opting for the blunt truth because lying to protect her feelings had already cost her a house. He's hiding it from the government. He tried to use Silas to help him move it, but I stopped him. Silas is safe. The money, Ingrid, you have to consider it gone. She let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp, and curled inward, wrapping her arms around her stomach. It was a brutal thing to witness. A proud woman realizing that her lifelong devotion to her son had been repaid with absolute ruin. Marcus stepped into the living room and set a fresh, steaming mug of tea on the coffee table in front of me. He sat down on the arm of my chair and rested his heavy, warm hand on my shoulder. I leaned into it, closing my eyes for just a second. What's the next move? Marcus asked quietly. We sleep, I said, opening my eyes. Tomorrow, I help Ingrid sort through her financial box to see exactly how bad the damage is. We figure out if there's any way to stall the foreclosure. The weekend dragged on in a suffocating, tense silence. Silas barely left his room. Noah tried to talk to him, but the conversations were short and clipped. Ingrid spent the days sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by decades of bank statements, tax tax returns, and utility bills. I sat with her for hours, organizing the paperwork into neat chronological stacks. It was an autopsy of her financial life. Conrad hadn't just taken the commercial loan against her house and the $50,000 in cash. He had systematically drained her over years. He had convinced her to co-sign credit cards for the miles and then max them out on business expenses. He had borrowed against her life insurance policy. By Sunday evening, the math was undeniable. She was nearly $200,000 in debt, entirely separate from the $850,000 commercial default. She would have to declare bankruptcy. At 71 years old, she had nothing left but the clothes in her suitcase. I went to the bakery early on Monday morning, desperate for the mindless, physical repetition of the kitchen. I needed to smell yeast and butter instead of old paper and panic. I was shaping croissants at 5:30 a.m., the rhythmic slap and fold of the dough grounding, when the bell above the front door chimed. It was too early for customers. The open sign was still flipped to closed, the front lights were off, and the door was locked. Or, it was supposed to be locked. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked out to the front counter. A man was standing near the pastry case. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a drab gray trench coat over slacks and a button-down shirt. He carried a battered leather briefcase. He looked bored, tired, and entirely unremarkable. "We're closed until 7, I said, my voice firm. The door should have been locked. "Nora Voss?" he asked. He didn't smile. He didn't introduce himself. "Yes, who are you?" He unclasped the briefcase, pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope, and placed it on the glass counter next to the register. "You have been served," he said flatly. He turned around and walked out the door, the bell chiming cheerfully behind him. I stood frozen for a long moment. The street lamps outside cast a pale, sickly light through the large front windows. I walked over to the counter and stared at the envelope. It had my name printed on the front in sterile, black typeface. I picked it up. It was heavy. I tore the sealed flap open and slid the documents out onto the counter. It wasn't a subpoena for a deposition. It was a formal notice of audit and asset freeze from the Internal Revenue Service, naming my bakery as a subsidiary entity of interest in the federal investigation of Conrad's logistics company. I read the first page, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. Conrad hadn't been making an empty threat in that storage unit. When the ears had started circling him weeks ago, he had hired an aggressive defense attorney to muddy the waters and stall for time. To do that, his legal team had submitted a list of potentially co-mingled assets to the federal auditors, claiming that large sums of his missing corporate capital had been quietly transferred into businesses owned by his family members. He had pointed them directly at me. The document explicitly referenced the $15,000 I had withdrawn from our joint savings account 4 years ago to sign the commercial lease for the bakery. Because the divorce had not been legally finalized at the exact moment of that withdrawal, the ears was now asserting that the bakery's seed money was marital property, and therefore subject to seizure to satisfy his $350,000 tax lien. I flipped to the second page. Effective immediately, pending a full forensic accounting of all business ledgers, inventory, and payroll accounts associated with the entity operating as the artisanal oven. A temporary freeze is hereby placed on all commercial bank accounts. My breath caught in my throat. I dropped the papers on the counter and practically sprinted to the small office in the back. I booted up my laptop, my hands shaking so badly I mistyped my password twice. I logged into the bakery's business banking portal. The screen loaded. Available balance. Cents. Status. Account frozen legal hold. I sat back in the cheap office chair, the air suddenly too thin to breathe. It was Monday. I had a $4,000 wholesale flour and dairy delivery arriving at noon that had to be paid upon receipt. I had payroll processing on Thursday for my 3 part-time employees. I had rent due on the storefront in 6 days. Everything I had built over the last 4 years, every pre-dawn morning, every burn on my forearms, every dollar I had meticulously saved and reinvested, locked away with a single keystroke. I picked up my phone and dialed my business lawyer, Claire. I got her voicemail. I left a breathless, disjointed message pleading with her to call me back the second she got into the office. I walked back out to the front counter. The smell of the proofing croissants, which usually brought me absolute joy, suddenly made me feel nauseous. I grabbed a trash bag and mechanically started throwing the raw pastries into the bin. There was no point in baking them. I couldn't process credit cards. I couldn't pay my vendors. The bakery was dead in the water. At 6:45 a.m., Marcus arrived. He let himself in through the back door, carrying 2 large paper cups of dark roast. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen, taking in the sight of the empty ovens, the unlit display cases, and me sitting on a stool near the sink, staring at the floor. "Nora," he said, setting the coffees down on the prep table. He walked over, his brow furrowed with deep concern. "What's wrong? Where is the morning bake?" I pointed to the manila envelope sitting on the flour-dusted stainless steel table. Marcus picked it up. He read in silence, his eyes tracking back and forth across the dense legal text. His jaw tightened. He read the second page, then slowly placed the documents back down. "They froze the operating account," I whispered, staring at my cracked, dry hands. "I have $0, Marcus. I have 50 pounds of butter arriving in 5 hours that I can't pay for. I have a mother-in-law facing bankruptcy in my spare room, and a son who won't speak to me." Marcus didn't offer empty reassurances. He didn't tell me it was going to be okay. He pulled up a stool, sat down opposite me, and leaned forward. "Call the dairy vendor. Cancel the delivery," Marcus said, his voice completely calm, anchoring me to the present moment. "If they've already loaded the truck, I will pay for the invoice in cash from my roastery's petty fund." We put a sign on the door saying closed for maintenance. "Marcus, I can't let you pay my vendors. I'm not asking for permission," he interrupted, his tone gentle but unyielding. "We triage the bleeding first. You call Claire again. You find out exactly what documentation the auditor needs to prove that $15,000 was unencumbered savings and not corporate fraud money. We drown them in paperwork." I looked up at him. He did this on purpose. He knew the feds were tearing his life apart, and he deliberately threw me in their path so they would spend months looking at my books instead of finding wherever he hid the rest of the money. Yes, he did, Marcus agreed flatly. He's a drowning man pulling down anyone he can reach. But you aren't going to drown. My phone vibrated violently against the metal table. I snatched it up, hoping it was Claire. It wasn't. It was a call from the local high school's main office. I answered, pressing the phone hard against my ear. Hello, Miss Voss. This is Principal Durbin. A stern, deeply uncomfortable voice said. I need you to come down to the school immediately. It's about Noah. My stomach plummeted into freefall. Noah had never been to the principal's office in his life. He was a straight-A student, the hockey captain, the kid who actively avoided conflict. Is he hurt? I demanded, standing up so fast the stool tipped backward and clattered against the floor. He is not physically injured. No, Principal Durbin said carefully. But there has been an altercation in the senior parking lot. The police are currently here taking a report. The police? I gasped, the room spinning slightly. What happened? Your son assaulted another student, Durbin said, his voice tight. He struck a classmate repeatedly. Noah is currently sitting in my office refusing to speak, and the other boy's parents are demanding we press charges. I didn't ask questions. I just hung up, grabbed my keys, and walked out of the bakery. Marcus didn't try to stop me. He just nodded and locked the door behind me. When I walked into Principal Durbin's office, Noah was sitting in a hard plastic chair. His knuckles were split and bleeding, staining the knees of his jeans. He looked up at me, his eyes dark and defiant, fully expecting me to scream. I didn't. I walked over, knelt in front of him, and gently took his hands in mine to check the cuts. Why? I asked quietly. It was Ryan Kellner, Noah muttered, his voice thick with unshed tears. His dad is a VP at one of the logistics firms Dad screwed over. Ryan stood up in the middle of homeroom and announced to everyone that Dad is facing federal indictments. He called Dad a thief. And then, he looked right at Silas and said we were probably going to lose our house too. Silas just put his head down on his desk. I told Ryan to shut his mouth. He laughed and called Silas a pathetic accomplice. So I hit him. And I kept hitting him until the teacher pulled me off. I closed my eyes. The blast radius. Conrad's destruction was bleeding into my children's high school hallways. I stood up and turned to Principal Durbin and the Kellner parents, who were sitting rigidly on the leather sofa across the room. Mr. Kellner was red-faced, opening his mouth to threaten me with police action. I beat him to it. Your son publicly harassed and defamed a minor regarding an active federal investigation that has absolutely nothing to do with him, I said, my voice dead calm but carrying a lethal weight. My son's reaction was unacceptable, and he will accept whatever school suspension you deem appropriate. But if you call the police, Mr. Kellner, my very first call will be to a civil litigator. I will sue you and your son for intentional infliction of emotional distress, and I will drag your family's name through the exact same public mud you think my family belongs in. The room went dead silent. Mr. Kellner blinked, his bluster evaporating. He looked at Durbin, then at his wife. They didn't press charges. Noah was suspended for 3 days. I walked my son out to the car, and for the first time in years, he leaned his head against my passenger window and cried. By Thursday, the tide finally turned. My lawyer, Claire, didn't just call the ear's auditor. She drove down to the federal building with 4 banker's boxes of my meticulously kept records. She slammed down the original, finalized divorce discovery documents, proving undeniably that the $15,000 was transferred into my sole possession a full 16 months before Conrad's current corporate entity was even incorporated. It wasn't co-mingled capital. It was my money. At 4:15 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was an automated alert from my business bank. The legal hold was lifted. The account was active. We didn't lose the bakery. Marcus had covered the dairy delivery out of his own pocket, and we spent the rest of the week baking like our lives depended on it. Because they did. Conrad's luck, however, finally ran out. 2 weeks later, the story hit the front page of the Chicago Tribune. He hadn't just been hiding $50,000 in crypto. The feds had tapped the burner phone he used to call Silas. They tracked his location to the storage unit hours after we left. They found the hard drive hidden inside the lining of a broken lamp. Conrad Voss was indicted on 7 counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and obstruction of justice. He was denied bail because he was deemed a flight risk. He didn't get the luxury high-rise. He got a 6x8 cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center downtown. It's been 6 months since that terrible week. Ingrid officially filed for bankruptcy. She lost the Evanston house, but she didn't lose her family. She lives in my guest room now. She helps me fold the pink bakery boxes in the evenings, and she knits thick wool sweaters for the boys. She is quieter, humbler, and finally free of the son who bled her dry. Silas didn't give up his college savings. He graduated high school last month, standing shoulder to shoulder with Noah, both of them holding their diplomas with genuine, unburdened smiles. Silas starts at the State University in the fall, studying landscape architecture. And this morning, at 5 a.m., I unlocked the front door of the artisanal oven. The street was quiet, the air crisp. I flipped the open sign, turned on the display case lights, and walked back into the kitchen. Marcus was already there. He handed me a cup of dark roast coffee, kissed my forehead, and started measuring out the rye flour without saying a word. I tied my apron around my waist, plunged my hands into the cool, waiting dough, and breathed in the smell of yeast and heavy cream. No chaos, no performance, just the quiet, steady rhythm of a life I built with my own 2 hands, surrounded by the people who stayed. That is the one thing that brings me absolute joy.